So, welcome again, Professor Bruno Drweski, the best professor of history of history of the revolutionary movement. And today I would like to start a new series of the 4 episodes, which is concentrated for the year 1956. 1956 is very important for the Marxist-Leninists. And today I would like to talk about Khrushchev, Khrushchev, how to pronounce his name in English. So
Okay. Okay.
So of course, the more important is the secret report of Khrushchev, which started to collapse of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, and not collapse.
Not total collapse.
Yes, but collapse.
Ideological collapse.
Yes, ideological collapse. But first, could you say something about Khrushchev? Who was Khrushchev? What was his career in the Bolshevik Party? Because it is very important for us to understand his secret report. What Khrushchev did in 1930s, for example.
Yes, for example, in 1930, Khrushchev is coming from Ukraine, from eastern Ukraine. Actually, he would rather be today called the Russian minority in Ukraine, from the Donbas region, and he was very much engaged in political activity in Ukraine. What is also important to tell, even if personal stories are not always very important, but we have to talk about it because it's the people rarely talk about that. His wife was Ukrainian, but even she was, we could say, national. I don't know if we can say nationalist, but she was national-oriented Ukrainian, and even she was coming by her family roots were from the Chełm region in eastern Poland, nowadays eastern Poland, and quite a lot of reports shows that she was always pushing Khrushchev to be very tough on national question, on national issues. Especially on border issues concerning Poland. For example, she was pushing her husband to intervene to Stalin when Stalin was thinking maybe the Lviv city should have autonomy because the Lviv city was majority Polish. She also intervened after the Second World War. So the Chełm region, which is belonging to Poland now, would be given to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. So it's quite important to talk about her. So to show that, first of all, within the Ukrainian Communist Party, there was a trend, a more nationalistic trend than we can suppose, and that Khrushchev was, to a certain extent, by his wife, linked with this national Ukrainian trend within the Ukrainian and so-called, and of course within the Soviet Communist Party. That's a point that is very rarely discussed because we always think about Khrushchev on the world scale, on Soviet scale, but we don't really understand that Soviet Union was a federation and that Ukraine was part of this federation, but Ukraine had its specificity, and the Ukrainian party was not the same as, let's say, the Belarusian party, the Russian party, and so on. And that's very important to understand that national prejudice existed in Soviet Union. Of course, from before the revolution, but this national prejudice existed also in communist parties, and especially in the Ukrainian Communist Party, because we have to remember that there were, at the very beginning of the revolution, there were two Communist Party in Ukraine. There was the Communist Party of Ukraine, Bolshevik, which was a section of the Bolshevik party of Soviet Russia and then of Soviet Union. And we had another party which was called the Ukrainian Communist Party, which was an independent Ukrainian party in favor of communism, of course, but with a much more deep, let's say, national orientation. And these two parties became one party after the victory of the Red Army in the Civil War. But anyway, during the whole history of Soviet Union and of Soviet Ukraine, we had these two, let's say, feelings within the party, a more, let's say, all Soviet internationalist tendency, and a rather national, even nationalist trend within the Ukrainian, the Communist Party of Ukraine. And it existed all through the history. And it's important to tell about that, because when we tell about the repression in Soviet Union in the 30s, according to, let's say, the mythical propaganda we have in the West, we could suppose that Stalin eliminated every differences and created a monolithic party, and this monolithic party was under a direct rule of personal rule of Stalin. And of course, it's a pure legend. There were, of course, repression and fights within the Soviet Union, that's for sure. But all through the history, if you analyze that, you will notice that the basic social trends existing in Soviet Union, in Soviet society, in Soviet party existed all through the 30s, 40s, up to the end of the party. I even remember personally, when I was in Poland in 1970, I was a political activist, and I had I was in charge of in Krakow of relation with foreign students. Among them, we had Soviet students. So I was, of course, in relation with the Soviet Komsomol organization of Soviet students in Krakow. And within the Soviet Union, we had Russian, we had Ukrainian, we had Lithuanians, we had different people coming from different regions of Soviet Union, different republic of Soviet Union. And I remember that one of the member of the party who was Ukrainian. She was from Kiev. Her father was in charge of quite an important function in Ukraine. She was not. She was frankly speaking about Ukrainian nationalism, how the Russians are chauvinistic against Ukrainian, that the Soviet Union is supposed to be a federation, that Soviet Union is not Russia, and so on and so on. And if you have this totalitarian, let's say, vision of Soviet Union, you should expect that she would be at least taken out of Poland and by the KGB and she should go back to Soviet Union. But that was not the case. I mean, I remember the Soviet Union, the Soviet students discussed with her. She laughed at her. They laughed at her. But anyway, she was perfectly free to speak in what I looked as a nationalist tendency, and that was quite important, taking into account that she was the daughter of some high-rank communist leader in Ukraine, in Soviet Ukraine. And it was for me very important because it was in the 70s. So it was showing that Ukrainian national or nationalist tendencies within the Communist Party of Soviet Union were not destroyed in the 30s. They survived. I mean, that was the best proof I can say. And if you look at the high level policy, you have to remember that in the 60s, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine was Piotr Szelest. And Piotr Szelest was an openly national-minded, if not nationalist, leader of the Communist Party of Ukraine in the 60s. He was really pro-Soviet, but with a very strong and declared Ukrainian national feeling. So what I'm going back to Khrushchev, we have to understand that since in the 30s, for a long time, Khrushchev was the chief of the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine. He was for sure a man with national Ukrainian-oriented tendencies, and apparently he managed quite well to let this tendency survive in the party in the 30s and later. And that's very important because first it shows that Soviet Union was not this monolithic totalitarian regime propaganda is always showing us. And that within the Communist Party, there were different orientations, ideological orientations or national orientations. Most of the time, both were mingled. Nationalist orientation mingled with, let's say, opportunistic orientations. And Khrushchev was one of the men in charge of that. Of course, all this aspect of history was forgot by the Western historians, by the Western propaganda, of course, but also by the leftist propaganda or leftist rather historians in the East, because to a certain extent we submit to the ideological hegemony of the of liberals, of capitalists, and we unconsciously very often accept the idea that yes, maybe Stalin was not so bad, but anyway, Soviet Union was something like a monolithic power, and then we just don't understand why in 1956 suddenly Khrushchev arrives and changed the political line. If we take into account the fact that Soviet Union was a real society, that the Communist Party of Soviet Union and the Communist Party of different republics were something vivid, something which was living with contradiction, with differences, then we understand, of course, that all the events tending toward Khrushchev, toward the revisionism, and at the very end toward the destruction of Soviet Union, they were all the time in the Soviet history. They existed from the very beginning up to the end, because Soviet Union and Soviet Communist Party was not monolithic. It was something deeply rooted in society, and within that party you had different point of views, different orientations, different social interests, and of course, when Stalin said that class struggle exist within socialism, it was not a pure slogan, because sometimes you hear that, oh, Stalin was telling that because it was for him a pretext to make his purges, his repression. But you know, it's just a way not to understand what was really going on. We can be for or against Stalin, but it's not very important. What is basically important is the fact that Stalin took into account the fact that Soviet Union was a real society. And a real society is a society where you have contradiction, and you have social contradiction. And social contradiction in Marxism, it is called class struggle. And you had class struggle within Soviet Union. And Khrushchev didn't land suddenly in 1956 with the idea, from today I will be a revisionist, and I will be anti-Marxist, and I will be anti-Stalinist. Of course not. Of course that there is a story, a personal story of Khrushchev, but this story has to be replaced in a story of a political trend existing all over Soviet Union, and especially in Ukraine, from where he came from. So in Ukraine, because all what I said, and especially the role of his wife, we understand that Khrushchev, at the very beginning, maybe he was not really Ukrainian-oriented, since he was, as I told you, coming from Donbass, and he was rather a Russian minority workers from the eastern Ukraine. But due to his wife, he began, of course, to be much more, let's say, deeply rooted in the Ukrainian point of view, and even I would say in the extremist point of view, since he didn't even accept, or he accepted with difficulties that the Polish-Ukrainian border would be a compromise border, giving, of course, Lviv and Lviv to Ukraine, but on the other side, giving Przemysl and Chełm to Poland. And this point is quite important, because it shows that, if you are really fighting for a territorial change in favor of your own nation, in this case, your own republic, it means you have very strong nationalist feeling, even if these feelings are working within a Soviet system, within Soviet parties. It shows that you have something which I would say is near to petit bourgeois nationalism. And that's a very important point, because if, for example, in the 30s, we look at the situation in Ukraine, we must always remember that when Khrushchev arrived at the top of the Communist Party of Ukraine, Ukraine was a very complicated republic, because it was a republic produced by a lot of contradiction. First of all, we have the central Ukraine around Kiev, which is rather Ukrainian speaking. But the south of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic was not only Crimea, but because Crimea would be given by Khrushchev to the Ukraine in the 50s. But earlier, all the area from Odessa up to Donbass was, and still is today, a Russian-speaking area, which has nothing to do with Ukraine. Basically, this area never belonged to the same entity as Ukraine. First, it was Turkish when Ukraine was Polish. And then it was taken by Russia and peopled by different nationalities, but mostly by Russian-speaking peoples. And Lenin decided at the end of the civil war, I mean Lenin, not only Lenin, but of course the decision was taken by Lenin after strong discussion within the party, that because of strong nationalist feeling in Ukraine, and to help Ukrainians feel at home in what was becoming Soviet Union, Soviet will accept to give to Ukrainian Republic territories which are not really Ukrainians, but which are geographically nearer Ukraine than Russia. And because the plan was, there were two plans. There was one plan that all these territories should belong to Ukrainian Republic. But there was another plan to have two republics. One republic of Ukraine in the north, and along the Black Sea shore, a second republic for the let's say mostly Russian-speaking region of Lower Ukraine, or of Black Sea region. And at the end, the party decided that all that will be to Ukraine. So the Ukrainian nationalists will not be able to accuse communists that they don't respect the Ukrainian national feelings. So they give to Ukraine the border nationalist Ukrainian wants, and then all that will go in the direction of socialism. But of course, this decision can be understood, and it's another question, but we have to take into account that from that moment, a Ukrainian republic became a republic with very strong differences, national differences, because in the north, central Ukraine, you had a majority of Ukrainian-speaking people. In the south, people were rather Russian-speaking. And all over Ukraine at that time, you had very strong national minorities. You had, of course, the Jewish minority, which was very important in the cities. And Jewish minority, when I'm calling about Jewish minority, I'm telling about a minority who was speaking its own language, Yiddish, at that time. They were not speaking Ukrainian, and they were not really speaking Russian at that time. They had their own language, which is Yiddish, and it's very important. We had a very strong German national minority along the Black Sea shore. We had a very strong Polish minority in the Zhytomyr area. We had other national minorities from very different backgrounds: Tatars, Bulgarians, and so on, Greeks. So Ukraine was a national mosaic, which was not only Ukrainian speaking. And this explains why within the Ukrainian Communist Party, the tension I told you about were very important between the ones, and Khrushchev was one of this player, which were considering that Ukrainian Republic should belong to Soviet Union, but should be Ukrainian. And it is the national republic of the Ukrainian nationality, and people who were rather advocating, in the same case as in Belarus, for example, that Ukraine, it's a territory. It's just a territory where, of course, the Ukrainian nationality is the majority, where the Ukrainian language is the majority, but where the Ukrainians are not the only one. And this republic is not the republic of the Ukrainians. It is the republic of the people living in Ukraine. And these tensions appeared all through the 20s and the 30s. And we have to remember that at the beginning of the at the end of the 20s and beginning of the 30s, the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine was not a Ukrainian, he was a Pole, Kosior. And apparently, but we should have historian researchers on that. Apparently, he was fired after he was criticized very strongly by Ukrainian-oriented people within the Communist Party of Ukraine. Of course, we have to take all that into account, but we have to take into account that in the Ukrainian parties, we had strong national tensions between, as I told you, Ukrainian communist, nationally oriented, Ukrainian communist, Soviet or much more Soviet oriented, communist from Ukrainian background, communist from Polish background, and communist from a Russian and Jewish background. So we had national problems and political problems. And if we look at that on this side, we understand that sometimes people like Khrushchev were working in, let's say, in the direction of Moscow-oriented lines, but only when Moscow did accept. I say Moscow and not Stalin, because it's not only a personal thing; it's a much more important thing. Only when Moscow was supporting the more, let's say, Ukrainian-oriented communists against, let's say, Polish communists or Jewish communists within the Communist Party of Ukraine. So that's one aspect we have to think about, the national or nationalistic tension within Ukraine, in which Khrushchev was not the man of Moscow. He was one of the local players against different groups. And sometimes he was, let's say, negotiating with Moscow when he was on the good position, and when he was in bad position, he supported, let's say, the situation locally. And Moscow had to deal with that, of course, not only in Ukraine, but especially here in Ukraine, had to deal with that. And the policy of Moscow was that some leaders sometimes have to be supported in Ukraine, so to make Ukraine not so ungovernable in a certain sense, and sometimes to take them to have a position in Moscow, so they quit local tensions and work for central authorities. And that's one of the aspects of Khrushchev, this issue. The second issue is that in the 30s, Khrushchev was apparently, of course, this also has to be much more studied by historians, but according, for example, to Grover Furr, who wrote a quite interesting book about Khrushchev and about Khrushchev in 1956. It seems that possible, very possible. Of course, much better researches have to be carried on, but at least the one he based on gives us some information that it is very, very possible that Khrushchev was linked with the Yezhov group. Yezhov, who was, of course, as you know, the chief in the middle of the 30s, the chief of the NKVD, and the man in charge of the repression, and the very tough repression of 1937. And some sources gives us the hypothesis that Khrushchev was linked with him and his group, and that would be very important to make research on, because this hypothesis would change all the vision we have about the 1930s repression, where always the propaganda is telling that the bad Stalin was using the poor Yezhov in mass repression, but when all this repression was carried on, then he killed Yezhov. And always it's the theory is that you have this bad Stalin that for personal reason is using some people, very tough, very hard people, but very naive people. And when they have done the job, then they are fired and killed. Of course, this vision of history is a vision which is this individualistic vision is, of course, a vision which is very liberal oriented, right wing oriented, and logical. If we look at history of humankind from the bourgeois point of view, but Marxists shouldn't accept that, because Marxists know that history is the history of social relation, of masses, and at individuals, of course, they have some importance, but basically individuals are taking side in the history because of social, on the base of social ground, on the base of class belonging, of the base of class struggle. So we have to carry on researches showing that all the tension we had in Soviet Union, in Soviet communism, in Soviet Communist Party, in the 20s, in the 30s, in the 50s, in the 70s, up to the end of Soviet Union, were class struggle. As Stalin said, we have to take into account the fact that the history of Soviet Union is the history of class struggle within the socialism. And that all repression, but I would say repression and counter-repression, because if we accept the fact that Soviet Union was a vivid society, if we accept the fact that there was class struggle in Soviet Union, if we accept the fact that there was class struggle within the Communist Party of Soviet Union, then all the individual fightings we know about, the Yezhov case, the Yagoda's case, the Tukhachevsky case, the Bukharin case, Kamenev and Trotsky, and so on and so on. Then all these tensions within the party do not appear as a conflict of individuals, even if, of course, they have some points to a certain extent, they are individual conflicts, but basically, they are a conflict between social orientations, between a class program and between class interests. And this has not been made. Theoretically, it has been made after 1956 by, let's say, Chinese or Albanian communists and Chinese and pro-Chinese and pro-Albanian communists. But it was purely on the theoretical level. Practically, there were no real analysis of the class struggle, how it did function. Really, how did it function within the Communist Party of Soviet Union? And this was not done by Marxists, and especially, I think it's mostly because the main intellectual critique of the, let's say, Stalinism, quote Stalinism, because of course I don't agree with that definition, was made by Trotskyists, and they don't want to have a real social class analysis of of Soviet society, because in that fight, it's very unsure, I would say, but even I could use a tougher word. It shows that Trotsky was not on the side of the proletariat, but he was on the side of the bourgeois elite within the Soviet system. So the critic we have from right-wing or anti-communist or from the Trotskyists are mostly a critic of individuals, and especially critic of the personality cult of Stalin, as if he was a god controlling all Soviet Union, and not at the top of a real society. And of course, Khrushchev went into that trend. Maybe Khrushchev was not a Trotskyist, but he used the Trotskyist way of explaining Stalinism, so-called Stalinism, under his critique of the cult of personality in 1956, pushing all the interpretation of Soviet history as a fight between an autocratic leader, Stalin, and the mass of the party, which should be pure and monolithical, in the sense that the party has nothing to do with that corrupt chief, who is Stalin. Of course, it's pure legend and it's pure bourgeois argumentation. You cannot accept the idea that one man, even if, of course, we agree with the fact that Stalin was not an idiot and was rather a quite clever and quite intelligent man, but still, one man is not controlling everything. And the question, the basic issues in the 30s, 40s, 50s, is not the fight between Stalin, Yezhov, Yagoda, Bukharin, Kamieniev, and so on, and so on, and so on. It's the class struggle between different orientations, having different social roots and eventually national roots, that are struggling one with the other. And Khrushchev was definitely on the side of a regional, let's say, even national interest, rather Ukrainian-oriented. And this interest was also linked with the fact that Ukraine was very important for the Soviet economy because of agriculture, because in the 30s, Ukraine was the only region of USSR producing enough food, not only to feed Soviet people, but what was very important for the industrialization program, Ukraine was the region who was able to export food to Western countries. That was needed for Soviet economy, so to import machine and technology and even engineers from Western countries, so to build a Soviet industrialization. So we can say that apart from the strict national or nationalist question of Ukraine, we have something in Soviet Union as a Ukrainian economical lobby, I would say like that, a Ukrainian economical lobby that knew that controlling Ukraine, you have a very strong voice in Moscow, because Moscow needs Ukraine so to be able to realize the industrialization program. The party decided in 1931, when Stalin at the party conference declared that if Soviet Union does not industrialize within 10 years, Soviet Union will be crushed. And it's very important if we take that into account, because in 1931, exactly 10 years after, Soviet Union was attacked by Nazi Germany. So when Stalin declared that at that conference, he was very clever. He was purely rationalistic. He knew that Soviet Union had only 10 years to build an industry able to defend the country against capitalist, Hitlerian in this fact, aggression, and that everything must be oriented within these 10 years toward the main object, which is industrialization. And he knew that who controls Ukraine controls the economy that will allow or not industrialization of Ukraine. And in this situation, he had, Moscow, not only Stalin as a man, but Moscow leadership had to negotiate all the time with the Ukrainian-based lobby. I say Ukrainian-based lobby because, of course, this Ukrainian-based lobby was partly national or nationalistic oriented, But it was much more important. This Ukrainian-based lobby, it was also a lobby of let's say, an economical lobby of people representing, let's say, the interest of the Ukrainian region within the Soviet Union, and able to negotiate with Moscow on quite a strong position. And of course, in the same time, Moscow and, let's say, the NKVD was conscious of the fact that this Ukrainian-based lobby is too important to be crushed. But because this Ukrainian-based lobby is important and is useful for Soviet Union, for the industrialization, but in a certain sense, this Ukrainian-based lobby can be dangerous for the unity of Soviet Union, and sometimes it has to be repressed. And the way Yezhov organized collectivization, and later Yezhov, Yagoda and Yezhov organized collectivization and repression, shows us that in fact they tended to control, but also to destroy some democratic aspect of the Ukrainian reality, for the development of that lobby. And if we understand that, then we understand that in fact Khrushchev, as the leader of the Ukrainian party in the middle of the 30s, was the man using this Ukrainian lobby to promote his career in Ukraine, of course, but in all Soviet Union. And then we understand, of course, that he was not a man of, let's say, Soviet-oriented internationalism. He was a man belonging to a very local, important, but a very local lobby within Soviet Union. And then we understand why, when he arrived at the top of the leadership in Soviet Union, he behaved not like an internationalist communist, but always like let's say, a manager, a Soviet, let's say, manager, working for specific interests within Soviet Union and for specific Soviet interests within the world. And of course, when I say specific Soviet interests within the world, I'm talking about local interests of Soviet, let's say, territory, not linked with the international communist movement and international communism and international revolution. And on that side, we can say Khrushchev was not a revolutionary. He was a counter-revolutionary. Maybe not from the very beginning. I don't know if in the 20s he was a counter-revolutionary. But I think that from the 30s up to the end of his life, he was more and more objectively counter-revolutionary, and linked with power lobbies within the Soviet Party. And this is why the issue of link of Khrushchev with Yezhov are so important, and that we have to talk about and to make researches on that theme, and researches on Soviet societies and researches about class struggle in Soviet Union before 1956. What I will say also, but if you have questions, just ask me. But anyway, what is important also is that the vision we have of Khrushchev, I told about more or less about the situation during the 30s. But of course, we have also to take into account the situation at the beginning of the 50s, because the legend we have is that Khrushchev, at the end of Stalin, when Stalin died, Khrushchev, step by step, eliminated his rivals. First Beria, then different people, Malenkov, and at the end Molotov and other Soviet leaders. And finally he arrived at the top of the party in 1956 at the 20 Congress, and especially at the 21st Congress of the party, when he was, let's say, the king of Soviet Union for a while. Of course, that's a pure bourgeois vision. That's a pure individualistic vision, because it doesn't cope with the basic fact that we have to ask, okay, Khrushchev was the man that took the leadership of Soviet Union, but whose interest he was representing. And if we just concentrate our attention to 20th Congress, we don't understand what happened at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956. We have to go back to the 19th Congress, which was the last Congress under the leadership of Stalin. And all what happened at the 20th Congress was aimed to destroy the decision of the 19th Congress. And it's not, it's not just like that. That bourgeois historians don't talk most of the time about the 19th Congress, or when they talk about the 19th Congress, they just talk in few sentences that it was the last Stalinist Congress, and Stalin wanted to control everything, and then they go up to the 20th Congress. But this is very clear for a Marxist why they talk all the time about the 20th Congress, but not about the 19th. The problem is that most Marxists do the same. They focus, even when they criticize the 20th Congress, they accept to focus on the 20th Congress. Of course, the 20th Congress was important. It was very important even. But you cannot understand the 20th Congress without the 19th one. Because the 20th Congress was the exact opposite of the earlier Congress. So you cannot, study the white color if you don't have the black color first into your mind, or the contrary. I would say even the contrary. I would say the 19th Congress was a red Congress, and the 20th Congress was rather a white Congress. But to understand the white Congress, we have to understand the red one. The 90, and it's very important if you look at the fact that the decision of the 90th Congress were only partly published. It means that between the 19th Congress and the death of Stalin, the new direction of the party leadership was not able, let's say, quote, able to publish all the documents of the 19th Congress. And this was not done up to date. It means that most of the documents of the 19th Congress are still in the Soviet or Russian archives, but they were never groundly analyzed by historians, and especially by Marxist historians, which is very important. Because if we understand that most of the decisions and discussions of the 19th Congress were never analyzed, it means that already after the 19th Congress, a large part of the Soviet Communist Party leadership could control publishing houses and party press, so to So people of Soviet Union could not really understand what happened at the 19th Congress, and that they were fighting already against, that there was a strong portion of the Soviet leadership that at the Stalin time, still Stalin time, who were fighting against the decisions of the 19th Congress. So we have a very strong struggle from 1952, not 1953, when Stalin died, but 1952, during the 19th Congress up to 1956. So it's very important to see that the class struggle in Soviet Union at that time, at that stage of the history, is not between Stalin and Khrushchev between 1953 and 1956. It's between, let's say, revisionists in the party between 1952 and 1956. And what Khrushchev managed to do is that he was able to take the leadership of the revisionist faction. He was not the only one revisionist in the party, but there were two fights. There was one fight against the decision of the 19th Congress, which was very strong among a lot of Soviet communist leaders, of Communist Party leaders, not only Khrushchev. And there was another fight, and there was a fight within the group of revisionists who will take the lead of the anti-Stalin line. And at the very end, of course, Khrushchev was, let's say, the best man to carry on that trend. And what he did, in a certain sense, if he was criticizing the cult of personality of Stalin at the 20th Congress, in fact, he created his own personality cult, in this sense that he became the symbol of the anti-Stalin line as a man, as an individual. So criticizing the person of Stalin, he created his own person as the only one, the best one of the anti-Stalin line, the symbol of anti-Stalin. And that's where Marxists are very, let's say, unproductive for a lot of time up to today. It's because it's in the sense that after 1956, most of Marxists in the world accepted to a certain extent this very individualistic interpretation of Soviet history. We have not to look at Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and so on, only as individuals. Of course, they were individuals, and individuals have a role in history. But basically, we must remember that we have to deal with social process, with class struggle process, and individuals are just the result. Even when they are genius, and I think that Stalin was to a certain extent genius, even when they are genius, they arrive at the good moment of history where they can be, let's say, used for one purpose. So we have not to focus on Khrushchev as a man. We have to understand that his personality fit very well with the trend of history of the 30s, but mostly of the 50s, when there was within the Soviet Communist Party a social base, a class base, to push Soviet Union on revisionist line. I say revisionist line because I don't think that Soviet Union became in 1956 in one day a bourgeois capitalist state. There was all the time from 1956 up to the end of Soviet Union in 1991, there was a class struggle within the party. Of course, we can say that before 1956, let's say the proletarian line was stronger and the bourgeois line was weaker, and that after 1956, most of the time, the bourgeois line was stronger and the proletarian line was weaker. But we had a class struggle all over the time. And the question is how to understand and place different person like Khrushchev, like Kosygin, like Brezhnev, like Shelestia, like and so on and so on. And in socialist countries, it's the same with Gomulka, with Mozart, with Gierek, with Kadar, with Ceausescu, with Honecker, with Ulbricht, and so on. We have the same question to ask. All these people, on which side of the class struggle within the socialist movement they were standing for? Because it's obvious that revolutionary processes are mass processes. And for me, it's very astonishing that we have a very good example of history that Marxists don't really use. It's the example of the French Revolution. Why I'm talking about that? French Revolution, of course, it's a bourgeois revolution. It's not a proletarian revolution. We all agree about that. But of course, it's a bourgeois revolution at the time of bourgeois revolution. And the French Revolution is very interesting because it's a complete historical sequence from the very beginning up to the end. And if we look at the French Revolution, we understand that we have class struggle within the French Revolution, leading from, let's say, constitutional monarchy to the radical Jacobin Republic, and from the Jacobin Republic, step by step, a reactionary movement pushing France toward a more and more bourgeois and less petit bourgeois republic up to Napoleon. And if we understand that, we understand that from all the very beginning of the revolution up to the end of the Napoleon regime, from 1789 year up to 1815 years, we had always a class struggle within French, let's say, revolutionary or post-revolutionary elite. And we cannot say that the day when Robespierre was killed, from that time, all the French Republican hierarchy is on the side of the big bourgeoisie, because still we had fights within the let's say, the state apparatus of a more left wing and a more right wing up to the end of Napoleon. And even later, because when the king came back in France, he was quite aware of the fact that he was back in the power, but that the revolutionary trend is still existing in France, and he has to take it into account. He was quite intelligent to understand that. So we had a class struggle in France, but this class struggle was also a class struggle within, let's say, the Republican elite. And it's obvious for us that people who were very strongly on the side of, let's say, the more radical Jacobin Republic later came rather on the side of a much more moderate republic, and so on and so on. And then if we look at the story of individuals in the French Revolution, we understand their links with the historical process, the class struggle process, the class process in France. But we don't do that with the Soviet Union. We don't do that with a socialist country. We just have the reaction bourgeois want us to have. It means good or bad. Is Khrushchev a good man or a bad man? Is Stalin a good man or a bad man? Is, let's say, Molotov a good man or a bad man? Is Gomulka a good man or a bad man? The question is not that. The basic issue is which class were they linked with, and on which side they stood at every moment of the development of class struggle. Of course, that the Khrushchev in the 20s was on the side of the proletariat. That's for sure. Because at that time, he was not a bourgeois. At that time, he was a worker, and he was fighting to have the right to live in his country as a non-exploited man. But as soon as he began a career within the Soviet Union, his links with different people from the party apparatus led him to, let's say, restore to a certain extent some bourgeois elements of culture he had, as all the Soviet society had. I mean, revolution is not a clear-cut moment where the day before revolution, the bourgeois culture is dominant in every mind, and the day after the revolution, they all become proletarian revolutionaries. Of course not. Of course that there are individual, local, social class trends within every people, and people are more or less oriented in one direction and another. And revisionism is not a clear-cut moment when people decide one evening, I'm a proletarian, and on the next day, on the morning, they wake up and they say, no, I'm a bourgeois, now capitalist. It's a very long trend. And of course that it's not very important. But anyway, I'm not sure that Khrushchev decided one day, okay, I will betray Stalin, I will betray the Communist Party, and I will be the leader of the restoration of capitalism in Soviet Union. I think this day never happened in his mind. But what is important is not that, is that he became the leader of the faction that decided step by step that the decisions of the 19th Congress of the Communist Party should be eliminated, because these decisions were going in the direction of a real democratization of the Soviet Party. In the same sense as, and that's why the books of Grover Furr on that aspect are very interesting, in the same sense that if you look in the 30s, at the debate around the question of a Soviet constitution and a Soviet electoral system, then you understand that there was a strong fight within the Soviet hierarchy between Stalin, who was advocating a more democratic electoral system, and a fraction of the party leadership, especially linked with Khrushchev, with Yezhov, and so on, who were against every form of democratization. And then you understand that in the 30s, like in the 50s, Stalin was not on the side of, let's say, an autocratic personal power, because he was a paranoic and he was loving to kill people. But there was a real debate about how to realize the main purpose of Soviet Union, which was to realize a Soviet democracy. And Stalin, not only Stalin, but I mean people linked with the view Stalin had, were in favor of a step-by-step democratization of Soviet Union, because Soviet society was a post-feudal society. And most of the communists of Soviet Union, maybe they were truly communist in their ideal, but most of the communists in Soviet Union were people that were brought up within the frame and the cultural frame of feudalism, not of socialist democracy. And it was for them much more easier to manage to govern Soviet Union using feudal tools than using socialist tools. And then you understand that the discussion Stalin led and lost, but the discussion Stalin led around the question of the Soviet Constitution in 1936, and the decision taken by the 19th Congress of the Communist Party in 1952, they are on the same logic. They are on the same logic. And you have also another point which is important, and who all anti-Stalinists never tell about, even bourgeois ones or Trotskyist one, is the fact that in 1946 Stalin managed, it was very hard for him to obtain the majority of the political bureau for the decision to suppress death penalty in Soviet Union. And this was suppressed between 1946 and 1948, I guess, and then the death penalty was taken back because of the Cold War. But this is not, a little element. I mean, if death penalty was suppressed in Soviet Union in 1946, it shows that the basic trend Stalin fought for in the 30s, in the 40s with this death penalty question, in the 19th Congress, was always tending to push Soviet communists to be more and more socialist and democratically oriented against nomenclatura petit bourgeois or bourgeois elite that created these lobbies I talked about within the party, and who were preparing, of course, at the beginning, unconsciously, but which were objectively preparing the revisionist line, and later the bourgeois line that, at the very end, crushed Soviet Union in 1991. So we have to rebuild. If we are really using Marxist methodology, we have to rebuild all the history of Soviet Union, taking into account class interest, lobby interest, social interest, and then we can begin to place individuals within this gigantic struggle we had. And Khrushchev, of course, is an individual who played a role in the bourgeois restoration through let's say, provisional stage, which was the revisionist one, just like when they killed Robespierre in France. They didn't decided that the next day the king will be back. They created the Thermidorian, let's say, half petit bourgeois republic, then the Directoriate, then Napoleon, and then the king came back. So the process of counter-revolution in France was not in one day. Of course, it was important for them to kill Robespierre, but it was the very beginning of the process of bourgeois takeover of France. So to realize this ideal, let's say, bourgeois compromise that worked all through the 19th century of the French history. And it's the same with Soviet Union, but of course on proletarian ground. The day Khrushchev, let's say, decided that officially Stalin will be denounced at the 20th century, the 20th Congress, it was the official beginning of the process that led to the restoration of capitalism in Soviet Union. The restoration of capitalism in Soviet Union appeared in 1991, not in 1956. It took time. Why? Because as in the same way French people, French society was not prepared and was not supporting when they killed Robespierre, was not in favor of a comeback of the king. Soviet masses wouldn't accept in 1956 the destruction of Soviet Union. You had to make a strong ideological re-education, reactionary re-education, but of course re-education to allow large part of the society, not the majority, but large part of the society to accept the idea that bourgeois democracy was better than socialist democracy. And this developed during a long time under umbrella of a better socialism, of a more democratic socialism, of a less bureaucratic socialism, of a less Stalinist socialism, with very strong resistance, as we had in France. I mean, in France, they killed Robespierre, but it didn't finish the Jacobins. The Jacobins existed all through French history after Robespierre beheading. They existed within the institution, outside the institution, during Napoleonic time, during the comeback of the king, and so on and so on. And exactly the same with Soviet Union and Soviet history. The day Khrushchev took over the party was not the day communists disappeared from Soviet Union. They still existed, and the direction of the Communist Party has to take that into account. And the fact that it took so long time to destroy Soviet Union shows how strong were the roots of the Soviet system within the society, and the fact that now Stalin is very popular in Russia shows that it would have been much more difficult in 1956 to destroy Soviet Union. It would be impossible, in fact. So that's why Khrushchev was the leader of a process that led to the end of Soviet Union, but he couldn't organize a bourgeois coup d'etat. He couldn't be a Soviet Pinochet. It was impossible because Chilean society was partly prepared to an anti-communist military coup, but Soviet society was not. So I don't know if maybe you have some question, because I talked quite a lot.
I have three questions, which I think they are simple. And one question that I think that you will take another 1 hour to respond.
So maybe next time, because it is so long.
Okay, so first I will ask these short questions. First question, I want to ask about the Crimea. And because you are said that the Crimea was given to Ukraine because of the regional status that is closer to Ukraine than the Russia. So why I want to ask why they didn't do the same thing with the Kaliningrad and the Lithuania.
Okay, yes, it's a good question.
Okay. You want all good. So
Okay, I
so,
will answer this question and then later.
okay.
For Kaliningrad, it's very important. It's a very good question. Why? Because it shows how Soviet Union was a federation. Because logically, geographically speaking, of course, you are right. Kaliningrad should belong to a Lithuanian Republic. But in Lithuania, we had as first secretary of party Sniečkus. And Sniečkus was in the same way I told you about Khrushchev as a Ukrainian national-oriented communist, Sniečkus was a Lithuanian national-oriented communist. He was loyal to Soviet Union in a certain sense, and all his career shows he never tend to fight for something like Lithuanian independence. But in the same time, within the Soviet Union, I would say he was, I don't know if we can say he was a nationalist, but at least he was a national-oriented man. And Communist Party member, and he was he negotiated with Moscow, and especially with Suslov, because he was very linked with the Suslov. He negotiated two things. The first thing he negotiated was that Lithuanian Republic will be loyal to Soviet Union at the condition that there will be no mass creation of industries that would permit a lot of immigration from other parts of Soviet Union, and especially of Russian-speaking people from other part of Soviet Union. He chose the exact opposite policy than the Latvian Republic. Latvian Republic party decided that the more people arrive from Soviet Union, from all Soviet Union, and the more Russian-speaking people arrive in Latvia, the more stable will be the Soviet regime in Latvia. Sniečkus decided the exact contrary. His opinion was that the more the Lithuanian Republic will have Lithuanian look and Lithuanian base, the more the Lithuanian people will accept the fact that Lithuania belonged to Lithuania. And that's the reason why in his negotiation with Moscow, the Soviet central leadership accepted that there will be no mass industrialization of Lithuania, so that there will be no need to import workers from Russian-speaking workers from all Soviet Union. Second question was that in the Vilnius area, in the area of the capital, the majority of the population was not Lithuanian, was Polish, the Polish minority. So he negotiated with Moscow, not with Warsaw, but he negotiated with Moscow that the Polish minority in Lithuania will have some cultural rights. Schools in Polish language, one national theater in Vilnius, a higher education, a pedagogical high school where they will learn Polish language and form Polish teachers for the Polish schools. But Poles from Lithuania will not be accepted at higher level of the party administration than the local ones, the Rayon one, where the Poles were in majority, but they will never arrive at the top level of the Lithuanian Republic. It was the exact contrary of the policy that was carried on the other side of the Republican border in Belarus. In Belarus, people from Polish a Soviet citizen from Polish origin could become minister, and he was. I mean, I met in Belarus the ministry. She was a woman, the Ministry of Education of the Belarusian Republic, and she was a Polish. Polish national minority of Belarus, and she was Minister of Education of the Republic, which would be unacceptable in Lithuania. And that's the reason
what was
why
her name?
I don't remember. I should. I don't. I have to check. But
Okay.
I met her just after the fall of Soviet Union, and I forgot how she. But she was the Ministry of the Education of the Belarusian Socialist Republic. And the third thing was the Kaliningrad area. Soviet Union, Soviet leadership, of course, logically decided that the Kaliningrad area should be part of the Lithuanian Republic. And Snieczkus intervened in Moscow, telling that he doesn't want Kaliningrad because Lithuanians are only 3 million. And Lithuanians are not couldn't colonize former East Prussia. They have no demographic strength to people this area. So of course this area will be peopled by people coming from all Soviet Union, mainly Russian. And he understood, and he was right, that former East Prussia, it's a territory that can have about 1 million inhabitants, that if this area belongs to Lithuania, there will be a strong Russian-speaking minority within Lithuania, and Lithuania will lose its Lithuanianness. So he negotiated with Suslov concretely the fact that Kaliningrad, I don't want Kaliningrad, take Kaliningrad to Russia. Okay, it's very well that Soviet Union controlled Kaliningrad, but as Russian city, as Russian territory, and not as a Lithuanian territory. I don't want Kaliningrad. I prefer it to be in Russian hands and not in Lithuanian hands. And that's of course why Kaliningrad belong up to date to Russia. It's a decision of Snieczkus, and it's a negotiation between Snieczkus and Suslov. Crimea is different because, first of all, you have to remember, as I told you, Khrushchev was from Russian origin. He was a Ukrainian-based, let's say, man, but he was from Russian origin. That's something which is quite important. He was not nationalist in this sense. That he was in favor of the Ukrainization of Ukraine, in the sense that he wanted to eliminate the Russian language. It was on this sense we can say he was not like Snieczkus, who wanted a republic in Lithuanian language. But he was the representative of what I told the Ukrainian regional lobby. It was a territorial lobby within the Soviet system. It was not only a nationalistic lobby. So the question if in Ukraine you should use Ukrainian language or Russian language was not a very important question for Khrushchev. What was important for him, it was that the Ukrainian lobby was strong in Moscow. The lobby of Ukrainian-based economical interest. And of course, in that purpose, Crimea was very important because Crimea is a strategical region. Crimea is, of course, the base of the Soviet fleet. In the southern Soviet fleet. Crimea is the area of holidays for Soviet people, but especially holidays for high-ranking Soviet people. So it's the place where it's easy to negotiate party decisions, because most decisions in the Soviet party system were not taken during the official reunion of the political bureau or of the central committee. The Soviet system functioned due to these lobbyists who were to a certain extent corrupting Soviet democracy. The basic decisions were taken privately. It means that the basic decisions were taken by high-ranking politicians during informal reunions, informal parties, informal alcoholic nights, and so on and so on. And then they were formally decided at the political bureau or the central committee session. Of course, it was undemocratic, but that was the way the lobbies functioned all over the history of Soviet Union. And so that's why Crimea was very important, because it was the area of holidays, of summer holidays. And a lot of Soviet leaders, not only from Ukraine, but from other parts of Soviet Union, spent their holidays on the Crimean seashore. And at that moment, they discussed very important political decisions that would be, let's say, imposed after they come back in Moscow at the political bureau reunion, at the central committee reunion, and so on and so on. So if you take Crimea within the Ukrainian Republic, you reinforce the Ukrainian-based lobby within the Soviet party, because you use the Crimea, the moment you go to Crimea to, let's say, to manipulate the high-ranking Soviet leadership. And this element is very important, especially if we take into account that Crimea was not only, was, of course, and that's important, the base for the Soviet military fleet in Sevastopol. It's, of course, very important. But also Crimea was the place where retired higher officers of the Soviet army most often wanted to spend their life. Of course, it's very logical. Crimea is a very pleasant area, and when you are retired, it's better to look for a better area, and it's better to decide I will spend my retirement on the Crimean seashore than in the deep Siberian north. That's human. That's very, very logical. And you have to take into account, of course, that retired people are not apolitical people. It's not because they have lost their position in the army that they have lost influence. Most often, especially in a traditional society, to a certain extent, Soviet society is a post-Russian empire society where family links, where personal links are very important, which is not a bad thing in absolute, but anyway, it's the situation. Retired higher ranking officers in Crimea, they have still contact with their colleague or their former colleague of the army, and they have some influence within the army. So if Crimea is linked with the Ukrainian party and not the central party, directly with the central party, it's also a tool of influence to Moscow. So this situation has to be taken into account. apart from, of course, the purely geographical aspect of this thing, that Crimea is territorially nearer Ukraine than Russia, if you take into account what I told earlier, that southern Ukraine was annexed to Ukraine. And that's why up today, the basic question of Ukraine is not only Crimea. The basic question is southern Ukraine, Russian-speaking Ukraine, really should belong to Ukraine or to Russia? And that's the basic question, because basically Odessa, Kherson, Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, all this area is Russian-speaking. It's not Ukrainian-speaking. So Crimea is only the southernmost part of that southern Ukraine, or rather Black Sea shore of Soviet Union. And if you understand that, you understand why Crimea was taken from direct Moscow control to Ukrainian Communist Party leadership, which was much more controlled by Khrushchev than the central party. To a certain extent, it reinforced the position of Khrushchev within the party when Crimea was annexed to Ukraine and taken from Russia.
Okay, my second question is about this report of Khrushchev. Could you give some examples of lies or truth which we can find them? Because for the anti-communist propaganda, they use argument that because Khrushchev was very important person in the party, so it is 100% true, all these things which he said. Can you say the example of the lies which are there?
You have a lot of them. It's a pity you didn't ask me that before, because I would have prepared some elements about that, and I don't really remember one element or the other, but most of the Khrushchev report against Stalin was made in a very, let's say, speedy manner, and that's very important, because normally, if you should discuss about Stalin and Stalinism, let's say scientifically, there are archives in Moscow, and a normal, let's say, de-Stalinization process, but it was impossible to carry on. A normal de-Stalinization process should have sent a commission of historians looking in the archives, discussing with people at different level of the Soviet societies, especially with former prisoners of the Gulag and so on, and then to make a report about the Stalin times. But they didn't choose that way. I mean, when you look at the Khrushchev report, you see that this report was written very quickly, very suddenly, and they pushed almost everything they could, so to accuse Stalin. But in the same time, they couldn't accuse Stalin of everything, because and that was their main problem.
Because Khrushchev didn't want to accuse himself.
That's the basic problem, because he he was the man. He was one of the men responsible for a lot of repression in the 30s. And logically, if you are intellectually speaking, the best built anti-Stalin trend, the best intellectually built anti-Stalin trend were two. It was the Trotsky one or the Bukharin one. Of course, we can think what we want, what we think about Trotsky and Bukharin, but we cannot hide the fact that these two people were representative of an authentic political line, which was built, which was logical, which was coherent. And let's say if you are an anti-Stalinist in Soviet Union in 1956, the more logical position you should take is either the, let's say, ultra-leftist, quote, Trotskyist one orientation, or the right-wing Bukharin one. But you couldn't do that. Khrushchev couldn't do that because he fought against these two factions because he was member of the fraction which had no interest in a complete bourgeois restoration in the 30s, and which has no interest with the, let's say, elitist intellectual takeover of Soviet Union by the Trotskyists. So he at that time, of course, he was against these two fractions. He fought against them, and later he represented let's say the interest of the developing within the Soviet party revisionists and let's say pushing in direction of a bourgeois restoration, but on the benefit of the new Soviet bourgeoisie, not of the old intellectual circles of the Bolshevik parties like Bukharin or Trotsky. So in that situation, he was in a very difficult situation because he had to criticize Stalin, but in the same time he had to still support some of the repression against Trotskyists or Bukharinists in the 30s. So he couldn't criticize all, let's say, the NKVD system, because he was part of this NKVD system within a fraction of the NKVD. And what is important also is that he couldn't even talk about Yezhov, because he was linked with Yezhov at that time, and it was difficult for him, of course, to put the name of Yezhov, and he was in a difficult situation. So he made something like a puzzle. You know, he began to take some element of the Stalin era, but this puzzle couldn't be finished. It was always a half-finished puzzle because some individual elements of repression were taken, and to make them more or less coherent, he created legend. And some facts are true, but without their context, and some facts are completely false. And of course, that's the same thing. We had no, and that's a failure of Marxists of today. We had no real scientific analysis of the Khrushchev report. Of course, we have the critics Grover made of this report, and that's important. But it's still, like I would say, the beginning of the process. We have now to really study this report, not point by point, but comparing the different points of the report with what the archives and different testimonies gives us as information. So to show that this report is it's not only a bunch of lies. It's partly lies, partly right. But it has been done very quickly, very superficially, and it's astonishing that the anti-Stalinists, I mean, I'm talking about the leftist anti-Stalinists. It's astonishing because they are mostly intellectuals. They are mostly educated intellectuals, and they don't want really to analyze these documents, which is, scientifically speaking, a pure, let's say, a pure bunch of nonsense. It's something that it's a propaganda document. It's not a historical analysis. It's completely unscientific. It's completely emotional. It's something which is completely anti-Marxist, but even anti-scientific, and there was no analysis, and that's, we have to be self-critical, because from 1956 up to today, we had very, very few works, scientific works, analyzing what was Khrushchev representing and what his report did present. Of course, that to a certain extent, in the Khrushchev report, you find some really true things, but they are always interpreted in an emotional way and not in a scientific way. And as I told you, it's an incoherent puzzle, an unfinished puzzle, and we should finish that puzzle. People of our side, we have to finish that puzzle, and then we will see that the puzzle will show a completely different image than the image Khrushchev gave. I'm quite sure about that, but that's our duty to finish that puzzle. And you will see that at the end, the image of the puzzle will be the opposite, quite the opposite of the image Khrushchev is showing, that the puzzle is going in the direction he wants to show. He wanted to show us. But that's we have in front of us quite a lot of work to do.
So my next question is, Bruno, are you tired?
A little bit, but why? You want 1 hour more? No, 1 hour.
No.
I think
okay. So I think that we can stop now, but only I will ask question which you can answer next time.
Yes.
So first, I would like that you present one more time this question about the lies, but you prepare for this. And second, it is that you give your definition of revisionism. What is revisionism, and what is your position to the discussion between Chinese party and and the Soviet party? Who is right in this discussion, and all this analysis of the critics of the which are made? So yes, now we are.
I just will answer the question of revisionism as a beginning. Revisionism is a process. Revisionism is not a coherent theory. Revisionism is the beginning of a process leading toward a new coherent theory. Revisionism is the process that led to a coherent system, which is called capitalism. Capitalism is coherent. Revisionism is not. Revisionism is just the bridge which allows to go from socialism to capitalism. Revisionism is just the bridge. It's not a social system. Like bridge is not a city, but bridge is useful to link different parts of the city. And revisionism, that's it. So we cannot find in revisionism something coherent, because the aim of revisionism is to lead to something coherent. Capitalism is coherent, but capitalism is the goal, conscious or unconscious. I will not say that every revisionist wants capitalism. I'm sure that a lot of revisionists were convinced, at least at the beginning, that they are fighting for a new pure socialism. But their illusion were leading, their idealistic illusion and not materialistic realities, their idealistic illusion were leading them in the direction of the restoration of capitalism. And that's very important if we look at the anti-revisionist literature we had in socialist countries, not in China or Albania. There, of course, for sure, but even in Soviet Union or in Poland in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we had a literature fighting against one or another aspect of revisionism, even if it was not always clear, but we had some resistance against revisionism. And they were always presented by the propaganda or by the liberal wings within the Communist Party as beton. We use that in Poland as the concrete, immobile people. And when for example, if you read now text of one Polish, let's say, moderate revisionism, which is Gomułka. If you read now the speech Gomułka made in 1968 with Ulbricht, the East German leader, analyzing at the secret reunion of Warsaw Pact leaders their speech concerning the events in Czechoslovakia at that time, it's very interesting, because what they said at that time happened 30 years later. Their critics of the Czechoslovak leadership of that time under Dubček at that time could be presented as the critics of archaic, neo-Stalinist, sectarian, and so on, communists. But when you read it now, it's just what happened in 1989. All what they criticized really happened. And you have to think, even Gomułka, who is not a Stalinist after all, but even Gomułka in his speech at that time was clever, that he was understanding that behind Dubček, it's the bourgeois counter-revolution that is happening in Czechoslovakia. And that's exactly what happened. But of course, it happened 30 years later. And so if you read now all critics of different aspects of revisionism made in different socialist countries from 1956 up to 1991, now you read them completely differently. Because at that time, they were looking as hardliner, unrealistic, tough people. But now you read them, and a lot of, I don't say they were always right, but very often what they read looks so real now, so real, that they were objectively analyzing historical process. Revision, let's say, pure revisionists wouldn't accept. And maybe I will finish with that, and it's very important. You have one of the revisionist leader of Poland, Karol Modzelewski, who was in the 60s even in jail because of his critique of the Polish party, and who was also in jail during the martial law in the 80s. And the difference between him and most of former revisionists is that up to the end of his life, he was always convinced that Marxism was still a good tool to explain social processes. And before the end of his life in bourgeois Poland, in capitalist Poland, he told something which humanly is very, very touching. And he told, if I knew in the 60s and 80s that I am in jail because I am fighting for the restoration of capitalism, I would never have done what I've done, and I would never have accepted to be in jail for the ideals I was fighting for, because these ideals were leading to capitalism, and I am against capitalism. So it's a very strong self-critic of his own revisionism, and it shows that he was not aware of the fact that he was serving capitalists. He truly believed he was serving a pure ideal socialism. But this didn't happen. And at the end of this life, he accepted the fact that he was used by a social process leading toward a direction he didn't want. At least he was honest. We can, of course, criticize his behaviors, his opinions, and so on, or we can criticize the fact that the party did jail him, that maybe the party could have negotiated with him, and so on and so on. That's all question. But anyway, at least he was honest. He accepted the fact that his revisionism led to capitalism, and that he was not in favor of capitalism. And in fact, that his life was used in a wrong way, according to him. But very few former revisionists accepted that. Michnik, for example, the man who is leading the main Polish liberal daily paper now, was also from revisionist circle. But now he's a pure liberal and very happy with his neoliberal orientation and pro-American, pro-NATO, pro-war, pro-whatever you want. He has no doubt about the fact that his revisionism was a very good bridge to a very good society, according to him, the capitalist society. So revisionism, you have to make the difference between revisionism as a objectively as an objective social process, and revisionists as individuals who were in favor of capitalism or in favor of a purely mythical socialism which couldn't exist.
Thank you, Bruno. C'était magnifique. It was your best speech here. So I am very, very impressed. I will finish this record